In 1974, on a tropical island, there was a missing persons case that left friends and relatives desperate for answers. It seemed as though the missing had disappeared from the face of the earth. What had happened to them? Were they lost and stranded? Had they been taken captive? Or was it something far more disturbing? Palmyra is an uninhabited island in the South Pacific, about 1,000 miles south of Hawaii. There is one boat anchorage known as the West Lagoon that is only accessible from a narrow man-made channel. Palmyra has no permanent residents and is mainly used as a stopover point for sailors on their way to Samoa, although some visitors travel there for peace, relaxation, and to get away from those everyday stresses of life. Palmyra is owned by the United States, and during World War II it was home to U.S. Navy base, and some remnants of the base still remain today. On June 26, 1974, a small sailboat named the Iola sailed into the West Lagoon anchorage on Palmyra with a crew of 2, a couple from Hawaii. The Iola had just completed a 19-day journey. It was a difficult voyage, and the boat limped into the lagoon barely seaworthy. The auxiliary motor seized up halfway through the journey, and the hull had begun taking on water. They had very little money and few provisions. They planned to live off the land until later in the year, when friends would bring them supplies in exchange for a crop of marijuana they intended to grow. When they arrived at Palmyra, they were unhappy to see a handful of visitors at the dock area. They had hoped they would have the island to themselves. When they came ashore, they were greeted by a small welcoming committee. They were a handful of yachters who by coincidence had all converged on the island at about the same time. This wasn't at all what the couple were expecting. They introduced themselves as Stephanie Stearns and Roy Allen, even though Buck was clearly tattooed on his right arm. When one of the yachtsmen said, "You've got Buck tattooed on your arm there," Stephanie claimed that it was his nickname. Shortly after Roy and Stephanie arrived, a beautiful 38-foot yacht called the Sea Wind sailed into the harbor. Like Roy and Stephanie, the new arrivals were surprised to see people there. They'd wanted to get away from the world for a while and intended to spend the better part of a year there, and were hoping to be alone. They made their way to the dock and introduced themselves as Mac and Muff Graham. When Mac and Muff met Roy and Stephanie, Roy noticed Mac was a smoker. He asked him for a cigarette. Mac obliged, and when he handed Roy the pack, he took more than half the cigarettes. This behavior would be considered disrespectful anywhere, but on an uninhabited island 1,000 miles from nowhere it was unacceptable. This was the first taste of what was to come. Roy didn't seem like an experienced sailor to the others on the island. He was rough around the edges, aggressive, and he seemed tougher than the other yachtsmen, and was boasting about how he was going to raise a crop of marijuana on the island. Mac Graham had a contact back in Hawaii that he stayed in regular communication with, named Kurt Shoemaker. They spoke over shortwave radio. Mac loved Palmyra. He enjoyed the beauty and natural resources of the island. He would explore the beaches and lagoons and go exploring through the jungle with a machete. He searched through the remains of the old Navy base and report to Q Shoemaker his latest discoveries. Additionally, Kurt helped greatly with communication by mail. He was in contact with both Mac and Muff Graham's mothers. Muff wrote a letter to her mother expressing her disenchantment with living on an island and her concerns about Roy and Stephanie. Dearest Mother, 3 boats are here now, but one is leaving and will take this letter with them. That leaves us alone with the hippie couple who plan to stay here and live off the land. It's just our luck they decided to roost on Palmyra. Roy and Stephanie have run out of sugar, cigarettes, and I don't know what. They bartered with the other boats. Next they will ask us. Bernard and Evelyn Leonard were leaving the island after a short stay, and they took the letters with them to mail once they got back to the Hawaiian Islands. Incoming mail was sent to Kurt Shoemaker, who would read them over his shortwave radio to the recipients back in Palmyra. Things were not going well for Roy and Stephanie. The crop of weed wasn't growing, the soil on the island wasn't well suited for growing marijuana, and the bugs were eating the seedlings. Their provisions were gone, and they were bartering the positions for food and supplies. The others tried to avoid them. They had been responsible enough to bring enough for themselves with a little extra for emergencies, but they couldn't afford to supply Roy and Stephanie. By this time, the other visitors on the island had all been on the Sea Wind and were given the grand tour of the boat by Mac and Muff. They all saw Roy and Stephanie as a nuisance, and Roy in particular as a violent, quick-tempered man who should be avoided. They warned the Grahams not to let them on their boat. But the Grahams were known for their hospitality, and Mac wanted to make an attempt at being cordial. 2 weeks later, Roy and Stephanie received an invitation to board the Sea Wind. They accepted without hesitation. The Sea Wind was a gorgeous yacht, large and luxurious, with a fully stocked bar and every high-tech navigational device on the market. Mac kept the boat in perfect condition, and Stephanie was smitten with the yacht and commented on how roomy and comfortable it was. Roy never said a word. By now, Roy and Stephanie had bartered almost all of their possessions for supplies. The Iola was small, cramped, damp on the inside with no food on board. Their tempers were running hot. They moved to the opposite side of the lagoon and would have nothing to do with the others. Roy abandoned the Iola for a makeshift tent on the beach while Stephanie stayed on the boat. Shouting and loud arguing was frequently heard from across the lagoon. Although Palmyra had abundant natural resources, Roy had virtually no knowledge of how to live off the land. He was seen in the jungle shooting a gun. Later, he was seen shooting fish in the lagoon. The sound of a chainsaw was heard coming from down the beach, so Mac Graham walked over to investigate, and what he saw infuriated him. Roy was cutting down a coconut tree to get the coconuts. Mac Graham loved the island and had no tolerance for its destruction, so he approached Roy and confronted him. He said, "What's your problem? This is stupid. You don't have to cut down the trees, you just climb up and get it." Roy told Mac to get the hell out of here and mind your own business. The hostility between them was building. Midway through August, a boat on its way to Samoa stopped in to spend a few days. Aboard the vessel were Norman Saunders and Thomas Wolfe. Norman was an expert at sailing the high seas and offered Roy and Stephanie advice on possibly sending the Iola to Samoa, but Roy just became angry and refused any advice. Wolfe and Saunders had cocktails with the Grahams that night, and Wolfe warned them that it would be easy for a couple to disappear on that island. Mac opened up a drawer and produced a .357 Magnum and said, "I can take care of myself. I'm tougher than he is." Wolfe and Saunders left Palmyra the next day. The departure of Wolfe and Saunders marked the end of the season, when boats would occasionally stop by Palmyra. Mac and Muff Graham were now alone on the island with Roy and Stephanie. By August 27th, Mac and Muff and Roy and Stephanie had been alone on Palmyra for 10 days. The tension between them had only increased. Mac's radio contact in Hawaii, Kurt Shoemaker, didn't like the sound of the events that were happening with Roy and Stephanie and expressed the thought that they ought to get out of there. Even Muff's mother in a letter said, "You need to get off that island or something bad will happen to you." Muff was aware that Roy had a gun and chainsaw, and this concerned her greatly. She wanted off Palmyra, but Mac refused to leave. Next time Mac and Kurt Shoemaker were on their scheduled radio talk, something unusual happened. In the middle of their conversation, Mac hears a female voice calling to him. He says, "Hold on a minute, let me go topside and see what's going on." When Mac gets back on the radio, he says, "Well, I'll be darned, she's coming over in her dinghy and says she has a cake for me. I guess they're going to declare a truce or something. I better check this out carefully." Kurt says, "Be careful now. Same schedule next week, same time. Talk to you then." A week passed, and Shoemaker arrived at a shortwave radio for their regularly scheduled conversation, but for the first time since Mac and Muff had left Hawaii for Palmyra, there was no reply from the Sea Wind. Kurt was very concerned about not being able to contact the Grahams. He kept trying for 20 to 30 minutes but got nothing. He tried a couple of days later and still got no response from the Sea Wind. After trying over and over for weeks and still getting nothing, he decided that something had happened to the Grahams and he had to act. Kurt Shoemaker was not able to convince the authorities to pursue the case of the missing Grahams, but he had a friend who was a pilot and was willing to fly over Palmyra to assess the situation. During the flyover, it was determined that there were no signs of life on the island. No boats, no Iola, no sea wind. Kurt knew in his heart that something bad had happened to the Grahams. All the incidents with Roy and Stephanie that Mac related to him all pointed to that one thing. none of the authorities willing to help with the case, Kurt took it upon himself and used his radio to call out to other yachtsmen in the South Pacific to be on the lookout for the Sea Wind. Weeks passed without a word on the whereabouts of the Sea Wind or Mac and Muff. After 2 months had passed since Kurt Shoemaker issued the lookout with no sightings of the Sea Wind, Bernard and Evelyn Leonard, who were given the last written message from the Grahams, were at the Ottawa Yacht Harbor in Hawaii when Bernard noticed a familiar-looking 38-foot yacht. Upon closer inspection, he discovered telltale markings that identified it as being the Sea Wind, and even though it had been painted over and the nameplate removed, Bernard was certain it was indeed the Sea Wind. Bernard called the Coast Guard and explained the situation. Feeling that this might be out of their jurisdiction, they called the Federal Bureau of Investigation, since the FBI has jurisdiction over crimes on the high seas. Special Agent Calvin Shishito responded to the scene, but more investigating needed to be done because at that moment there was no conclusive evidence to prove that a crime had been committed. They weren't even sure if the vessel in question was actually the Sea Wind. The Coast Guard posted a lookout in the harbor, and the next morning they spotted Roy and Stephanie in a dinghy rowing towards shore. The owner of a boat in the harbor called out to Roy and Stephanie and alerted them that the Coast Guard had been looking over their boat the day before. Roy looked around and spotted a Coast Guard patrol boat in the harbor and started rowing as fast as he could for the nearest dock. Roy jumped out of the dinghy and onto the nearest dock, while Stephanie took control of the boat and started heading back to the Sea Wind. When 2 policemen spotted Roy, he dove off the dock and swam away, but as he jumped, his wallet came out of his pocket. Inside the wallet, the officers found a picture ID belonging to Roy Allen. When Bernard Leonard looked at the picture, he said, "That's Roy Allen." The Coast Guard boat with Bernard Leonard and one of the Coast Guardsmen aboard caught up to Stephanie just as she made it to land. She made a run for it and went up a stairwell that went nowhere. With no options left, Stephanie was handcuffed and taken into custody. On the way to the Coast Guard station, Bernard and Stephanie rowed back in Stephanie's rowboat, which was in tow behind the patrol boat. Alone and face to face, Bernard asked Stephanie if the Grahams were alive. She shook her head. She said Mac and Muff invited them for dinner aboard the Sea Wind, but the Grahams never showed up. The next morning, they found their Zodiac boat overturned on the shore of the lagoon. She then said they searched for the bodies but found nothing, so they decided to take their own boat, the Iola, back to Hawaii, but it got hung up on the reef and they took the Sea Wind instead. Bernard did not believe her. When they arrived at the Coast Guard office, Stephanie told her story again, but this time it was very different than the story she told to Bernard Leonard. This time, she said they found the Grahams' overturned Zodiac in a can of gasoline nearby, so they flipped the Zodiac over and used it to search for the Grahams. When they failed to find them, they took the Sea Wind back to Hawaii with the Iola in tow, but the Iola hit a reef and sank. She was caught in her first lie. At this point, FBI Special Agent Shishito had enough evidence to arrest Stephanie on a transportation of stolen property charge. Now the focus of the investigation turned to Roy Allen, who had evaded arrest and had still not been found. When Shishito ran the ID found on the dock, there was no record of a Roy Allen. Bernard Leonard had previously informed Shishito that Roy Allen was planting marijuana on the island to sell. Thinking that someone taking part in this type of activity must be involved in drug trafficking, Shishito took the ID to the Drug Enforcement Agency and showed them Roy Allen's picture. Several agents recognized the man in the picture as a fugitive named Buck Walker. He was a convicted felon who, while awaiting sentencing on a drug charge, fled to Hawaii from Palmyra in the Iola. Now with the DEA in charge of the investigation, Special Agent Shishito focused on the whereabouts of the Grahams. He was concerned that they may still be alive but stranded without food or supplies, so he and some other special agents traveled to Palmyra to search for them and possibly evidence of a crime. A search of the island turned up no trace of the Grahams, but they did make some interesting discoveries. They found the remains of the makeshift tent that Buck Walker had been staying in. They also found a hatch cover identified as belonging to the Iola. This was possible evidence that it was deliberately sunk because no boater would go out to sea without the hatch cover. Water could get in and cause it to sink. Upon searching an old Navy warehouse, Shishito found something that he found especially curious. An old sea rescue boat that had 3 openings in the bow built to house 3 metal containers used to store provisions. In the 3 openings, only 1 container remained. there were 2 missing containers that were large enough to store the remains of the Grahams. After finding no trace of the Grahams and no hard evidence, the agents traveled back to Hawaii. Up to this point, Buck Walker was still missing 10 days after his getaway when he resurfaced in a tiny motel in Hawaii. He left the motel and headed to a restaurant. At the same time, 2 police officers were eating lunch across the street. They showed their waitress a picture of Buck Walker and asked if she had seen him. She said that he was just in the restaurant looking for a drink, and she sent him to a bar across the street. They arrested Buck Walker on a fugitive charge without incident. Under questioning, Buck remained silent. He revealed nothing whatsoever that would help the investigation. With Stephanie Stearns in prison and awaiting trial, Agent Shishito was informed that she was getting some photographs developed. Shishito seized them once they were developed, and on inspection found a picture of Stephanie on the Sea Wind with Buck Walker alongside the Iola at full sail. This contradicted the stories that both Stephanie and Buck told the authorities. Shishito was convinced that the Grahams were murdered, but without bodies or hard evidence, the case was deemed strictly circumstantial and would not be brought to trial. Both Buck and Stephanie were convicted of interstate transportation of stolen property. Buck Walker received 10 years for his previous drug conviction and 5 years for the theft of the Sea Wind. Stephanie Stearns received 2 years for her role in the boat theft. In January 1981, 7 years had passed since the Grahams went missing. Shishito still wondered about the Grahams, and the case was still fresh on his mind when his office got a phone call about some human bones found on Palmyra. Shishito was excited. He was the only one left at the office who had been there long enough to remember the case, and his first thought was, bones on Palmyra, this has to be the Grahams. The couple, Robert and Sharon Jordan from South Africa, who found the bones, waited there on Palmyra for Agent Shishito along with a team of investigators to arrive. Upon arriving, the investigators found bones and a human skull spilling out of a metal container, identical to the one Shishito found on the rescue boat on his previous visit. When the team got back to Honolulu, they sent the container along with the skull and bones to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. The lab found that the skull belonged to a female in her late 40s or early 50s, and dental records showed that it was definitely Muff Graham. There was also a hole in the left temple that the FBI concluded was caused by a gunshot. The metal box went through a battery of tests to determine if Muff had been inside the box. The metal was found to contain traces of human protein. This proved without a doubt that the box once contained a human body. In addition to the human protein, it was found that the remains had been burned in the container while it sat in about 2 inches of water. The FBI now had enough evidence to charge Buck and Stephanie with murder. At this point, Stephanie had served her time and had an office job in California. She was arrested and held on murder charges. Buck Walker was still in prison, but during the extradition process, Shishito was shocked to find out that Buck had escaped. By locating the only woman that had visited him in prison, they tracked Buck down to a hotel in a small town in Nevada. The FBI set up a stakeout and arrested him the next day. He was charged with the murder of Muff Graham. Stephanie was arrested under the same charges as Buck, but they were tried separately. In addition to the circumstantial evidence and the container with Muff Graham's bones inside, Shishito and his investigators performed a test to see if the Graham zodiac could be accidentally flipped. They tried various methods, but no matter how much they tried, the zodiac would not flip over. Even if it had been upside down, the engine would have been flooded with seawater and would no longer run. A difficult thing for the prosecution was to subpoena all the witnesses for the trial. They had to round up about 40 witnesses to testify. People were flying in from all over the world. Robert and Karen Jordan, the couple who found Muff's remains, flew in twice from South Africa. Another problem was that a lot of the witnesses were boating people who traveled frequently. They lived in boats with no fixed address. Luckily, everyone who needed to show up for the trial was able to show up. There were only 2 suspects who could have committed the murder, Buck and Stephanie. One of the questions in the trial was how much involvement did Stephanie have in the murder. One advantage that she had was that she could blame Buck. He was much bigger than her and had an extensive criminal record. He was also the one seen shooting the gun. Buck Walker was found guilty after the jury deliberated for just 2 hours. He was sentenced to life in prison. Stephanie Stearns was represented by high-profile attorney Vincent Bugliosi, famous for prosecuting Charles Manson and the Manson family in the Tate LaBianca murders. She was acquitted of all charges. To this day, Matt Graham's remains have not been found.